Hello and most welcome to 1814 of the Heidegger series. We will today continue the started article by Francis Lin, Wittgenstein on thinking as a process or an activity. And last time we spoke, we went into how is it possible, would it be possible that thinking is not, could be an accompanying process, and in what way is it not possible? And different examples are given, among others, how you could possibly train yourself to let words follow actions or thinking. Here's an example, the second paragraph where I left off at page 11. Suppose this: I am watching someone writing out a series of numbers 1, 5, 11, 19, and suddenly the formula A equals 2 to the pi to the power of 2 plus n comes up in my mind. So I say, I now understand. Now is the process, the mental occurrence of the formula. Understanding. Surely not, for it is perfectly possible that the formula should occur to someone. And yet he does not understand the series. E.g., that is, for instance, he does not know mathematics, but the formula is painted on a wall in his bedroom, and now he sees the formula in his mental eye. But we can call the mental occurrence of the formula understanding under some particular circumstances. For example, if the person has learnt algebra, has used such formula before. Under such circumstances, if one has the mental occurrence of the formula, then we may say that he understands. or equivalently, that the mental process is understanding. So there is no contradiction in saying both that the mental occurrence of the formula is not understanding, and that it is understanding under certain circumstances. Since the mental occurrence of the formula is not understanding, we are then tempted to think that understanding must be another process which occurs side by side with the mental occurrence of the formula. As well put. Sorry for my... But Wittgenstein rejects this idea too. He understands must have more in it than the formula, than the formula occurs to him, and equally more than any of those more or less characteristic accompaniments or manifestations of understanding. The first part of the remark is clear enough. As explained just now, the mental occurrence of the formula is not understanding. The second part of the remark makes 2 points. One, when we suddenly understand a series, many things may happen. For instance, the glowing of the eyes, the release of the tension, the shouting out of "I can now go on," etc. And 2, none of these accompanying processes is understanding. Point 1 is straightforward, and everyone can agree to it. What about point 2? Is it also plain truth? I think the answer is positive. Just as it is conceivable that a person has the formula coming up in his mind and yet does not understand the series, it is also conceivable that the person brings about some or all of those accompanying processes, and yet still that does not understand the series. This is also a grammatical fact about the word understand. So there is no accompanying process which can be identified with understanding. The above digression is very helpful for understanding Wittgenstein's remark PI 332 concerning thinking. Just as no accompanying process is understanding, no accompanying mental process is thinking. This is why in PI 332, Wittgenstein says that accompaniment is not what we mean by thought. So there is no contradiction in saying that that thinking is sometimes an accompanying mental process, and that thinking is not an accompanying mental process. PI 332 actually provides a way of seeing that thinking is not an accompanying process. Wittgenstein first asks us to say a sentence. For instance, the pen sentence with thought. What shall we do apart from saying the sentence? We may conjure up an image of a pen, make a face, shrug the shoulders, etc. He then asks us to just repeat these processes. It is clear that these processes do not guarantee that a person is thinking. For it is conceivable that he brings about all these processes and yet does not really have the thought. The pen is blunt. Oh well, it'll do. That is, if the person is play acting. This is analogous to singing a tune. When one sings a tune with expression, He may move his body and he may breathe fast or slow, etc. But if one simply repeats this expression, then one is not singing. So no accompanying process is singing, just as no accompanying process is thinking. To sum up the discussion so far, through exegeting PI 332, we have now understood that the last sentence of PI 330, which says that thought is not constituted by an accompanying mental process, or equivalently, that thinking is not an accompanying mental process. When one speaks with thought, it is not that there are two separate processes going on. One is speaking and the other is thinking. This is what Wittgenstein means by the following remark. Thinking is not an incorporeal process which lends life and sense to speaking, and which it would be possible to detach from speaking. Rather, as the devil took the shadow of Schlemil from the ground. Notice that the reason we have been considering why thinking is not an accompanying mental process is that such a process can occur and yet the person is not thinking. So this shows that an accompanying mental process is insufficient for thinking. It is also unnecessary for thinking. I think the answer is positive. Take speaking with thought, for instance. When one speaks with thought, there might be some accompanying processes. For instance, the occurrence of a mental image, facial expressions, body movement, etc. But none of these must happen. That is also a grammatical fact for anyone who looks at how the word thinking is used in various cases will agree to it. In this subsection, we have seen that Wittgenstein's explanation for the conclusion that thinking is not an accompanying process is that such processes are not sufficient for thinking. A person can bring about many accompanying processes, and yet he might not be thinking. Wittgenstein does not explicitly talk about the unnecessity of accompanying processes for thinking, but an explanation for the unnecessity can be easily provided. What about the second method, which we saw in sections 2.1 to 2.3? Does Wittgenstein show that accompanying processes by themselves are dead? And need thinking to make them alive? Consider the speaking of the sentence, "Yes, this pen is blunt. Oh well, it'll do again." The accompanying processes may include the occurrence of mental images, facial expressions, body movement, etc. But these can be variously interpreted, and they by themselves cannot reach up to the pen. So it could be said, we should call any process dead in this sense. The dead accompanying process, the dead accompanying processes cannot be identified with thinking. This is also what is meant by Wittgenstein's remark that accompaniment is not what we mean by thought. So both of the two methods are employed by Wittgenstein to show that thinking is not an accompanying process. Summary. In this section, I examined Wittgenstein's remarks concerning thinking as a process and showed that thinking is not a series of images or speaking, either silent or aloud, or a mental process accompanying other processes such as speaking. Wittgenstein employs two methods to achieve this. One is to show that such a process is neither necessary nor sufficient for thinking. And the other being to show that such a process is by itself dead, needing thinking to become alive, so cannot fill the role which is expected of thinking. It is thus clear that thinking is not a mental occurrence of images, nor inner speech, nor an accompanying mental process. We might therefore expect Wittgenstein to say that thinking is not a mental process. But we do not find him saying this. Rather, what he says seems to be softer. He writes in philosophy, the comparison of thinking to a process that goes on in secret is a misleading one. He even writes, one might say, thinking is an incorporeal process. So one might get the impression that Wittgenstein's position on whether thinking is a mental process is unclear or even confused. These difficult remarks by Wittgenstein have certainly caused trouble for the commentators. I shall deal with them in section 4 below. Take a sip of coffee. Thinking as an activity. In the preceding section, we have seen how Wittgenstein tries to fight against the temptation to regard thinking as a process. In this section, I shall examine his treatment of the questions whether thinking is an activity, and in doing so, I shall also analyze some commentators' interpretations and point out their inadequacies. Orders such as think it over and think before you act might tempt us to regard thinking as an activity. In doing so, I shall also analyze some commentators' interpretation and point out their inadequacies. Orders such as think it over, think before you act, might tempt us to regard thinking as an activity, while Wittgenstein does deal with this temptation. Commentators are divided on what the position is on whether thinking is an activity. A major reason for this is that Wittgenstein is not explicit on this issue. Below are some of the most relevant remarks by him. It is misleading then to talk of thinking as of a mental activity, and one could say of the word thinking that it is not an activity word. Thinking is a mental activity. Thinking is not a bodily activity. Is thinking an activity? Well, one may tell someone, think it over, but if someone in obeying this order talks to himself or even to someone else, does he then carry out two activities? Therefore, thinking really cannot be compared to an activity properly, for one cannot say that thinking means speaking in one's imagination. This can be done without thinking. It can be seen from these remarks that Wittgenstein does not say explicitly whether thinking is or is not a mental activity. This gives rise to various interpretations of what Wittgenstein actually means to say. Free one, is thinking an activity? Heidegger argues that there are some differences between thinking and typical activities, and hence that thinking is not an activity. This argument is unconvincing. There are some differences between penguins and typical birds. But this is not an argument for saying that penguins are not birds. So why is thinking not an activity just because it is somewhat different from typical activities? Scheer argues that for Wittgenstein, thinking is not an activity, writing, Wittgenstein believed it was an error to suppose that the word thinking is ever used to refer to an activity. But in those places, Wittgenstein does not say explicitly that thinking is never an activity. Scheer uses another way to express Wittgenstein's idea, which is thinking is not an activity which can be carried out independently of or along with other activities. Now, are these two statements the same? That thinking is not or never an activity, and that thinking is not an independent activity? Scheer seems to take for granted that they are the same, without providing an explanation. I shall come back to this problem later. Hanfling takes issue with hackers, and hence also Scheer's statement that thinking is not an activity. He argues that certain kinds of thinking are activities because they share some characteristics with typical activities. These kinds of thinking include speaking aloud, to think a question over, to make an argument, going over words in the mind, working out a piece of music at the piano, writing a paper to solve a problem. That was good old Hanfling. Hanfling's point is that it is not true that thinking is never an activity, but that some kinds of thinking are. There seems to be a problem with the statement that certain kinds of thinking are activities. What is the point of making it? In other words, what philosophical significance does it have? This problem is discussed by Schroeder In his opinion, such statement is philosophically unhelpful and utterly useless, because it effectively says something like thinking is speaking under certain circumstances. Schroeder argues that this statement leaves just the interesting bit, for it does not explain under what circumstances a verbal utterance counts as thinking. Although Schroeder only singles out the statement involving the activity of speaking, his argument could also apply to statements involving other activities. For instance, thinking is going over words in the mind under certain circumstances. Thinking is working out something under certain circumstances. Thinking is writing under certain circumstances. Surely, each of these statements itself does not specify the relevant circumstances in which the activity is thinking. But are they really philosophically unhelpful and useless? In the first place, we can certainly specify the circumstances. For example, a lawyer speaking in a court in defense of his client is thinking. A student writing in an important exam is thinking. And so on. In the second place, such an exercise is indeed philosophically important. What this exercise does is to describe various circumstances in which the word thinking can be correctly used. In fact, Wittgenstein himself points out that various activities under certain circumstances are thinking. Witness the experience of thinking may be just the experience of saying, or may consist of this experience plus others which accompany it. Talking under particular circumstances and whatever else corresponds to that is thinking. The word thinking can be used to signify, roughly speaking, talking for a purpose, that is, as speaking or writing, as speaking in the imagination, as speaking in the head, as it were. So an activity under certain circumstances can be thinking. This is a grammatical fact, and everyone who reflects on how the word thinking is used on various occasions would see this. Now, what is the use of reminding ourselves of this grammatical fact? Well, it can help us to see the following points. Thinking, a widely ramified concept, a concept that comprises many manifestations of life. The phenomena of thinking are widely scattered. If we include thinking silently, as one is working in our considerations, then we see that our concept thinking is widely ramified, like a ramified traffic network which connects many out-of-the-way places with each other. In all of these widely separated cases, we speak of thinking. So, for the conclusion, one could say that thinking as a sort of grammar. It's a part of the grammar of language. It doesn't mean that it has an essence to it, that it is an activity, something that happens or something you decide to do. It is not the origin of speaking. It is not a necessary accompaniment of speaking, thinking. Thinking is in the language, and to put it extremely short, we have come to essentialize it and not to follow the proper grammatical use of the word thinking. This is, of course, similar and a reinforcement of what we said before, of thinking not being an inner speech, nor being images. Thinking is not a thing or a process or an activity. In some cases it almost looked that way, but it doesn't go the whole way to become a generalized activity, whatever that could mean. It is in itself very problematic to think that there is a general activity that covers running, playing, cooking, thinking. Those are all activities. Maybe there's a family resemblance, but there is no identity. They don't have similarities like that. That would be absurd. And I think that is now absolutely clear after reading Francis Ling's wonderful article. Thank you very much for today. Have a very pleasant morning, day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye for now.